Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival and to Story Shop in the Spiegel tent. My name is Eleanor, and I work for the City of Literature Trust. Edinburgh was designated a City of Literature in 2004, and as part of the wonderful designation that UNESCO has given to our literary city, the City of Literature Trust was created to champion that designation and to find and encourage and discover the wonderful width and breadth of talent that we have in this city, and we have a lot of talent in this city. We've been running Story Shop for 10 years now, which is fantastic. In the beginning, it was with published authors, and then in 2009, the platform became an opportunity for emerging writers to make that step from aspiring to published, which is a brilliant jump to make, and we're very proud of it. So, without further ado, I will introduce our writer for today. Today's writer is Janet Nixon, and she will be reading her story, Letting Go.
Thank you. Letting go. Maureen's not doing so well today, Mr. McAllister, the nurse said. Billy almost said who. Somewhere between boy and young man, he'd gone from Billy to Bill to William. Only Mo called him Billy now, but his sister had always been Mo. Mo, he said instead. The nurse looked at him quizzically. Had he spoken or just groaned? It was hard to tell sometimes with old folk. Mo, he said again. Everyone calls her Mo. Ah, Mo. I'm afraid Mo's not doing well. But there's something you can do. Well, we can make her comfortable, of course. The nurse looked uncertain now. You know more your sister's prognosis. She's in and out now. More out, really. I'm sorry. But there must be something. The nurse looked even less certain now, and young. But then almost everyone looked young to Billy these days. Well, she said after her pause, in her 6 months on the oncology ward, she'd seen a few elderly relatives keel over with the shock of bad news. And Billy was more devoted than most. He'd visited his sister every single day since she'd been on the ward. Plenty of husbands did less. Today was going to be hard for Billy. You really need to speak to the doctor, but I think we're getting close to the end. He remembered his father telling him when Billy was complaining about something his sister had done. Broken one of his toys? Who knows now? It was so long ago. Be nice to your sister. It's the longest relationship you'll ever have. Billy must have looked confused and probably appalled, because his father had roared with laughter and said, think about it. Everybody else will come into your life later or leave earlier, but you and Mo will be together for pretty much all of it. And in truth, even then he hadn't minded Mo. She did steal his toys and sometimes followed him round like a puppy, but at least she wasn't like Tommy Cook's wee sister. She didn't try to kiss his friends or turn cartwheels in a skirt. She might have been a girl and 2 years younger than him, but his sister was the fiercest creature he'd ever known. And he, a man who'd known active service in World War II and been a mean amateur boxer in his day. An image came to him of Mo. She would have been 5. She'd followed him and Tommy all day as they chased butterflies with that huge old net Tommy's dad had given them. As the owner of the precious net, Tommy had claimed the job of catching the butterflies. Billy's job was to transfer them to a glass jar with holes drilled in the lid. Mo had been happy enough following them round, squealing when they caught a butterfly, squealing even louder when one got away. It was only when it was getting dark and time to go home, she'd looked at the pathetic, fluttering creatures imprisoned in the jar and asked, what you going to do with them? Tommy had grinned and said, kill 'em, stick 'em in books on pins like me dad does. Mo had screamed. She had just thrown back her head and screamed. Then she turned to Billy and said, you let them go, Billy. You let them go. Billy had looked from Tommy to his sister. Tommy smirked at Billy, already confident in the bonds of male friendship. They both knew kid sisters were stupid and that no one ever took any notice of them. Mo just stared at Billy, fierce blue eyes boring into him, a 5-year-old ball of fury. Of course he let the butterflies go. Mr. McAllister, Mr. McAllister, the nurse was speaking again. No, it wasn't the nurse. They had been joined by someone else, another young woman. This one was wearing a white coat with a stethoscope round her neck. A doctor. Mr. McAllister, she said again, I'm Dr. Adams. Already he didn't like her. She bristled with business-like efficiency, looking at the clipboard she held, briefly at him, then too quickly back to the clipboard. I'm afraid your sister declined rapidly overnight. It does sometimes happen at this stage. She touched his arm lightly and held his eyes. I'm sorry. Maybe she wasn't so bad after all. Just busy. Everyone was so damned busy these days. He was taken to a different room, not the main ward where Mo had been previously, but to a side room, a few feet away from the main ward. Evidently someone had decided last night that she should be moved, less for her sake, he suspected, than for the other patients in the ward. She lay on her back in the bed in the small room, the thin hospital blanket pulled up to her chest, her arms lying on top, stick-thin and bruised where the papery skin could no longer cope with the endless blood samples and injections. Her head was propped up on 2 pillows, her eyes were closed, and she was completely still. Had he not heard the laboured breathing, Billy would have thought he was already too late. A plastic catheter was stuck into the flesh on the top of her hand and held in place with sticky tape. He knew this was for the morphine. He knew also that there was another catheter hidden under the bedclothes. Even moving from bed to commode was now beyond her, and that, if he stayed on the left side of the bed, he could avoid seeing what it connected to. He sat on the chair next to the bed and shuffled closer to her. He touched her hair, so white and fine it was barely more substantial than tendrils of smoke. Is she in pain? He asked the nurse. We're doing everything we can to keep her comfortable. Mo groaned softly. No, she's in pain. Can you give her some more painkillers? The nurse's eyes flicked to the drip. We've already increased the morphine dosage considerably. If we put it any higher, the organs just wouldn't cope. I'll leave you together for a while. She slipped out of the room before he could reply. Someone had tried to tidy Mo up, brushed her hair, what little was left, sprayed some lily of the valley on her, and even put a bit of blusher and powder on her cheeks. Mo would have been horrified. The perfume was Old Lady scent and the makeup badly applied. Mo had always had high standards when it came to her appearance. No, Mo had always had high standards, period, as our American cousins would say. The Americans. What would Mo have been when she insisted on dating that American soldier? Billy fought to remember. 18 maybe? And what was his name? Their parents had been shocked, probably more worried about Mo's reputation than guilty of any real hostility. Things were just different in the 40s, but their father had been adamant. You try to leave this house, Mo, and I'll lock you in your room. Mo had been equally adamant. You let me go, or next time I leave this house, I'll go for good. 18 years old, working a factory job paying $2 a week, and barely a change of clothes to her name. She didn't even own a suitcase. Where did she think she could have gone? Still, their father must have believed that she would leave, because she'd gone on that date, and quite a few others with, Billy remembered now, Roger, a nice boy, about the same age as Billy, just a little bit homesick and a little bit scared. All the flyers must have been scared, although they tried not to show it, and Roger had thought the world of Mo. Who knows what would have happened? If things had been different, Billy might have had Yank nieces and nephews and known all about the Super Bowl. No, the truth is, by the time his plane didn't come back from that mission, the whole family had grown very fond of Roger. Mr. McAllister. The doctor was in the room, looking around as though expecting to see another chair. Ordinarily, he would have stood and offered her his seat, but his legs felt heavy and numb. She leaned back against the door frame and consulted her clipboard again. We really need to talk about what comes next. Billy looked up at her. When is she going to wake up? She isn't going to wake up, I'm sorry. But she was talking to me yesterday, and now she's like this, and she's getting worse. She's in pain, and the nurse told me can't do anything. I can increase the morphine. That would help her to feel more comfortable, but the nurse said that her organs couldn't cope. That is a possibility, Mr. McAllister. If I increase the morphine, it will put more stress on her organs, and they may shut down. It is certainly not the intention, but it is a possibility. She paused and looked directly at Billy. It is a strong possibility. Billy just shook his head. Mo had never backed down from a fight in her life. The doctor nodded. Can we call anyone to come and sit with you? A relative? Billy shook his head again. No one to call. His wife was long dead and his daughter was in Australia, a teacher, like her Auntie Mo had been. Ellie and he had been well into their 30s when they'd married. Sarah had come along and they'd hoped for a brother or a sister for her, but it just hadn't happened. Billy had especially hoped for a brother for her. 60 he'd been when Ellie had passed, just retired from the factory, and Sarah was 2 months into her first job in Australia. She'd offered to give it up, bless her, come home. And he'd nearly let her. He had explained to Mo how lonely he was, how lost, and that Sarah really didn't mind. And Mo had fixed him with those blue eyes of hers and said, well, you can let her. Of course, she'll never forgive you, and I doubt you'll ever forgive yourself. So Sarah had stayed in Australia, and Mo had missed her almost as much as Billy. When the doctor returned, she checked Mo gently and took up a position leaning against the door. I'm afraid she's getting quite uncomfortable, Mr. McAllister. Have you given any more thought to what I said earlier? I can increase the morphine to ease her pain, but only if you agree that's the right choice. Billy looked from Mo to the doctor, then back to Mo. Brothers and sisters, butterflies and jars, the longest relationship of a long life.
Thank you very much, Janet. We're here every day. It's a free story at 3 o'clock in the Spiegel tent. So please come back and join us again tomorrow, where you'll hear a story from Beth Cochran. Thank you very much.